Today's daf is daf Pei Beis, and we're going to start on Pei Aleph Amid Beis, 6 lines up from the bottom. And the Mishnah says, "V'lo yavi michite maser sheni." So the halacha is that when you bring a carbon mincha, and that is to be brought from chita, and you mafresh maser sheni, which is the maser of years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle. So those chitim of Maser Sheni cannot be brought as a karba mincha. In other words, you can't kill two birds with one stone and try to use Maser Sheni for the karma. But the most Maser Sheni, that's a different story. If you do a pigeon on Maser Sheni, right, the Torah says, V'tzarta kesef b'yodecha, you don't have to carry all the maser to Yerushalayim to eat it in Yerushalayim b'kedusha v'tara, but rather you can transfer the kedusha from the chita over to the mos, and then take the mos up to Yerushalayim and buy food in Yerushalayim. You could use those mos to buy a carbon. So the Gemara quotes of Nachman v'Rav Chizda, the Amrit Shevayu, they both agree, Lo shanu ela michite maser sheni. So let's say we have various menachos that come from wheat. We also have lechamim, like for example the shtei lechem on Shavuos, or for example the lechamim that have to accompany a carbon toda, 40 lechamim. So you cannot use chitim that have been already designated as maser sheni for, let's say, the lechamim of a carbon toda. However, chitim alakuchos mimos maser sheni. Let's say you come to Yerushalayim after doing pigeon with the mos maser sheni, and you want to buy chitim from the mos maser sheni. That already has a different status. That's already like one step removed from maser sheni itself, and therefore you can use that wheat that you purchased with the pigeon money of maser sheni in order to bring your lechamim that would accompany your carbon toda. Yosef Rabbi Yirmiyah Kamed Rabbi Zerav Yosef Kamar Lo shanu ela michite maser sheni. When the Mishnah teaches us that you're not supposed to bring the carbon toda from the wheat that was designated as maser sheni, right? The original maser sheni. That's only because those chitim were designated as maser sheni. Aval michitim alakuchos b'mos maser sheni yavi, but he's allowed to take the wheat that he purchased from maser sheni money, meaning the pigeon money that he brought up to Shalim, and he wants to buy wheat that he can use for the lachme toda. Amaleh. So after this presentation of Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Zera responded and he said, Rebbe, Ata Omer Ken, is this a serious ruling of yours? Ani Omer, but Rabbi Zera says, Afilu michitim halakuchos b'mos ma'aser sheni lo yofi. Meaning even the monies that were brought to Yerushalayim as ma'aser sheni money, and now you want to buy lachme toda with that ma'aser sheni money, you cannot do so. So Rashi here tries to reconcile Rabbi Zera's response with the Mishnah. The Mishnah seemed to say that lo yavi michiti maaser sheni el mimos maaser sheni. So you're allowed to use the most of maaser sheni, and yet here Rabbi Zera seems to assume that afilu michite lekuchos b'maaser sheni lo yavi. So Rashi says the following: if he initially used the most maaser sheni to buy wheat, and he's going to consume that wheat in order to fulfill his mitzvah of Maser Sheni, he cannot re-channel or redirect that wheat for another mitzvah, in this case for Lachmei Toda. Either Mishnah says you're allowed to do so. That heter to use Maser Sheni money for buying wheat for the Korban Toda, for Lachmei Toda, means that he cannot, let's say, purchase wheat and use it for lachmei toda, unless he had specifically bought the wheat for the purpose of lachmei toda. So let's see if we can explain this as we go along. Now, Rabbi Zera, in his intellectual honesty, so to speak, is going to explain why Rabbi Yirmiyah said what he said and why I, meaning Rabbi Zera, disagree with Rabbi Yirmiyah. Ema taimach didi ve'ema taimach didei. Ema taimach didach. First, let me start with understanding your reasoning. Toda mehecha kayolfisla. What was in the previous sugya the source for the heter of using Meiser Sheni money to buy wheat for the carbon toda? Mishlomit. We had Gzeira Shava equating Toda and Lachmei Toda with Shlomit. Now, Meiser Sheni money you're allowed to use to buy Shlomim. And therefore, by virtue of this equation between Shlomim and Lachmei Toda, you're allowed to use the most Meiser Sheni to purchase Lachmei Toda, like you could use it for purchasing Shlomim. And here we could begin on Daf Pei Beis, our daf for today. Ushlamim. Now, how do we know that shlamim itself you're allowed to use most Meiser Sheni to buy a carbon shlamim? Sham shami maser. We have a Gzeira Shava to equate it with Maser Sheni, meaning that shlomim could be a substitute for the Maser Sheni, and the most that you use, after pidyon you use to buy food in Yerushalayim could be designated for shlomim. Umina. And now that you equated Toda and Lachmei Toda to Shlomim, so you say the following: Ma Shlomim ein gufon maser, af Toda nami ein gufon maser. Right? So we're saying the following: you took the money of Maser Sheni when you purchased Shlomim. So Shlomim itself is not Maser Sheni. In other words, when you use the most of Maser Sheni to buy food, that food does not acquire the sanctity or the status of Maser Sheni. It's not like another pigeon. Like we first started a pigeon back in the farms where we cut down our grains, and we uploaded that tithe, that tenth onto mos. That mos has kedushas maser sheni. But when I take those mos to Yerushalayim and I buy something with those mos, that does not substitute for the maser sheni. It doesn't have the status of maser sheni. Now we equate toda to shlomim. So af toda nami ein gufon maser. So when we use the wheat, let's go back one step. When we use the domim of pidyon maser sheni to buy wheat, and we're going to use that wheat for lachmei toda, that wheat does not have the status of maser. Because again, as we said before, it's like one step removed. Vahani chiti halakuchos b'mos maser sheni nami ein gufon maser. So therefore, we can buy chitim with most maser sheni, and it doesn't have the status of maser sheni. If it doesn't have the inherent status of maser sheni, I could use it for lachmei toda. But Rabbi Zera says, Ema Tamadidi. Now I'm going to explain why I disagree with you. And I say that you cannot use those bushels of wheat that you purchase with most maser sheni for lachmei toda. Why? Because toda mecha kayalfina lamishlamim. Ushlamim sham mimaser. So the source for toda is the equation to shlamim. And shlomim itself is derived from Gzeira Shava from a Maser Sheni. So what do I derive in the equation between Lachmei Toda and Shlomim? Ma Shlomim ein min Maser, af Toda ein min Maser. So we have to figure out, what does Reb Zera mean when he says Shlomim ein min maser? Shlomim is a zevach. It's not like lachmei toda. And therefore a zevach, which is an animal, cannot become maser sheni. So you cannot say that when he uses the funds of pidyon maser sheni to purchase an animal for shlomim, that animal becomes maser sheni. There's no such thing. Maser sheni is on grain, the 5 species of grain, and not on an animal. Af toda, even though toda comes from grains, meaning lachmei toda, we're going to say by virtue of the equation between lachmei toda and shlomim that it's ein min maser. That the carbon shlomim is not related to maser because it's an animal. But by virtue of the equation to toda, even the toda can't be maser sheni. And therefore, afuke chitim alakuchos b'mos maser sheni to bin maser ninhu. Rabbi Zera is not willing to say that we have one step removed, and therefore it doesn't have the status of maser sheni. Only in the case of an animal, by virtue of the fact that it's an animal and it's not wheat or grains that grow from the ground, it cannot be maser sheni. Masha enkein, in contrast, in the case of lachmei toda, You could extend the status of Maser Sheni even to the wheat that you purchase with Mo's Maser Sheni. For the even though you designated it for Lachmi Toda, it cannot remove its status as Maser Sheni. Only in the case of an animal can you remove it from the status of Maser Sheni. If one initially purchases wheat with sanctified money for consumption as ordinary Maser Sheni, that wheat is of the kind of the original Maser Sheni. In other words, it has the Kedusha of Maser Sheni. Therefore, cannot be designated for Toda breads, Lachmi Toda. What is permitted is only to spend Maser Sheni funds on wheat. See, this is the subtle distinction here that I don't fully comprehend. Let me try it one more time. I think I'm getting it. Just give me a second. Sorry. Okay. So I think I got it. Let's go back for a minute to Shlomo. Right? So he took Maser Sheni money and he bought an animal for a korban. So then the animal does not have the status of Maser Sheni, therefore could be brought as a korban Shlomo. So too, if he would take the monies of Maser Sheni and purchase wheat for the purpose of Lachmei Toda, then it's Lachmei Toda and it's not Maser Sheni, like the Shlomim are not Maser Sheni. But if, on the other hand, he went ahead and he purchased wheat for the purpose of eating the wheat, now he wants to use this wheat and dedicate it for and designate it for Lachmei Toda, that he can't do. Why? Because that wheat already took upon itself the status of Maser Sheni. Because that wheat, like the original grains that grew in his field, have the status of Maser Sheni. Again, it's not the original wheat, obviously, because he was pod to that wheat. But through the process of pigeon, he now substitutes the wheat that he gets in Yerushalayim from the wheat that grew in his field in Akko. So the only time, says Rabbi Zeir, that the Mishnah would allow you to designate Lachmei Toda from Mos of Maser Sheni is only if you purchase with that Mos Maser Sheni wheat, not for the purpose of eating the wheat, but for the purpose of bringing that wheat as Lachmei Toda. Then it becomes similar to Shlomim, and it's antithetical to the status of Maser Sheni because in the case of Shlomim, it's not Maser Sheni. And by virtue of the analogy to Lachmei Toda, it's Lachmei Toda and it's not Maser Sheni. That's Rabbi Zeir. Omer of Ami. So we're now here on Daf Pei Beis. Hamatvis mos Maser Sheni l'Shlomim lo kanu Shlomim. In other words, Ravi Ami is saying that He took Masasheni money and he designated it for the purpose of a Karban Shlomim. Lo Kanu Shlomim. So let me take a shot at this. Matfis is different than the case in our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, he takes Maser Sheni money and when he buys the wheat, let's say in the case of Toda, and we'll have a similar case in Shlomim, but if he buys the wheat for the purpose of Lachme Toda, then he's able to change the status of the wheat from Maser Sheni to Lachme Toda. But what's this case here of Rabbi Ami? He wants to take the mos, and instead of buying an animal, let's say in the case of Shlomim, or wheat in the case of Lachmi Toda, he wants to do a hatfasa, which means that he wants to somehow change the status of the Maser Sheni mos. He wants to now convert them to Shlomim or Lachmi Toda. So again, matfis means that he somehow designates the Maseches money for Shlomim or Lachmei Toda. That he can't do because he doesn't have the power to convert Maseches money to Shlomim. It has the status of Maseches. It doesn't allow for a different status of Maseches. What he can do, though, is he can go ahead, take those funds, and buy what he wants to buy. Let's say he buys an animal for Shlomim, or for the Toda, whatever it is. And then we say that the animal doesn't have the status of Maseches, and therefore he can take this animal and use it for Shlomim. But if he wants to designate the mos themselves and convert the mos from Maseches to Shlomim, that he can't do. My taima, the Gemara explains, the lo alima kedushas hashlomim lemechil akedushas Maseches. Right? He can't. What's the word I want to use? He can't clone onto Maseches the kedusha of Shlomim because those mos have the kedusha of Maseches. Again, what do you do with the mos of Maseches? You buy something. So you want to buy an animal, and then you want to designate that animal for Shlomim, or you buy wheat and you want to designate that wheat for Lachmei Toda. That you could do. That's the Mishnah. But what you can't do, says Rav Ami, is take the mos and say that these mos are now Shlomim mos or Lachmei Toda mos, to convert and transform the kedusha of the damim, which is kedushas Maseches, into kedushas Shlomim. And now the Gemara apparently attacks Rav Ami from a Mishnah. Where's this Mishnah? In the first chapter of Maseches. Halokeach chayo lezivchei shlomim ubehema libsar tava lo yotza ha'or lechulin. So again, he has Maseches money, which he takes to Yerushalayim, and a chaya, which would be a deer, is not fit for the mizbeach. We don't have any carbon of a chaya. We only have carbon of behemos, which means bakar, son, like gedim or sheep, but not a chaya. Now, there's something called basar taiva, right? When you shecht an animal to eat its meat, not for a carbon shlomim, that's called basar taiva or basar chulin. So if I want to use my Maseches money in order to purchase a chaya for shlomim, which cannot be, or a behema for besar taiva, so that if he fulfills his mitzvah properly, he'll take the most of Maseches to Yerushalayim. There he'll buy behema with the funds of Maseches in Yerushalayim, and he could bring it as a carbon shlomim. He can't do that in the case of a chaya. In the case of a chaya, he can use the damim to purchase basar taiva. I think it's called venison, right? So now there's a Mishnah Maseches where instead of doing what he was supposed to do, he buys not meat for the sake of shlomim, but rather meat for the sake of basar taiva. He was meant to take the domim and purchase meat for the sake of a shlomim, but he didn't do so. Or he should have brought, right? He buys a chaya for the sake of a shlomim. I mean, a chaya can't come as shlomim. Okay. So now the Mishnah says, Lo yotza ha'or lechulin. If he would have purchased the animal for shlomim, a behemoth for shlomim, or chaya for the sake of basar taiva, then the kedusha that goes from the domim into the animal is limited to that which is edible. The hide, however, is a secondary byproduct and the or does not attain kedusha. So although the money that he spent buying and he paid an extra X amount for the hides, nevertheless, it's all chulin. It all becomes chulin, because whenever you buy something in Yerushalayim with most Meiser Sheni, then that which you buy is chulin, unless it's designated as a korban. So the Meiser Sheni money is now spent on food. And that which is kadosh for the mizbeach, let's say if he buys a korban shlomim, that's kadosh, but the rest of it is chulin. But here, in our case, strangely enough, he purchased a chaya for the sake of a shlomim, a behema for the sake of basar taiva, and therefore the or is lo yotza l'chulin. So I'm going to read to you the note here. He says, with respect to a behema purchased for basar taiva, and his intention was that it should be treated as ordinary Meiser Sheni, the Mishnah means that the hide retains Meiser Sheni's sanctity. Right? Lo yotza or l'chulin. And therefore you sell it and you use the proceeds to buy food that would be eaten in Yerushalayim. The money was spent improperly for behema that is for basar taiva, not for shlomim. So although normally the Torah gives a dispensation with regard to secondary products, but that only applies when he spends the Meiser Sheni money in the proper way. So if he spends Meiser Sheni money on food, then the accompaniment to the food, such as the hide of the animal or the barrel in which the wine is stored, is considered chulin, special dispensation. With respect to a chaya purchased for the sake of shlomim, the Mishnah can mean either that the hide has Meiser Sheni sanctity or that it has shlomim sanctity. All right, that's already okay. So now lav lememer dekani shlomim. So in the case of a chaya they purchase for the purpose of shlomim. Does the Mishnah not mean to say that the shlomim acquires the hide, meaning that it becomes consecrated for the purpose of shlomim? There are two ways to view a chaya that was purchased with Maser Sheni money for the purpose of shlomim. If shlomim sanctity takes hold on it, its value becomes consecrated for the purpose of shlomim. If shlomim sanctity does not take effect, then it ought to be considered an ordinary chaya of Maser Sheni for gratification. Now, assuming that the shlomim sanctity does take hold, it is understandable why even the hide is consecrated. Since the animal stands to be sold rather than eaten, and even the hide is fit to be sold, it too is consecrated for the sake of shlomim. But if the shlomim sanctity does not take hold, then this animal should be treated no differently than a chaya that was explicitly purchased for meat gratification, and its hide should be chulin. The Mishnah teaches that the hide is consecrated, right? Lo yotzel chulin. It means that the shlomim sanctity takes effect on the chaya and its hide, so that the value is consecrated for the purpose of shlomim. Now, designating the value of a chaya for the purpose of shlomim is tantamount to designating money for this purpose. If shlomim sanctity could not take hold on Maser Sheni money, right? That was Rabbi Ami. Then the chaya purchased with Maser Sheni funds could not possibly acquire shlomim sanctity. Obviously, therefore, we infer from this Mishnah that the shlomim sanctity can take effect on top of the Maser Sheni sanctity. Is lav lememer de kani shlomim, right? So the words the kani shlomim, the Gemara means that it becomes kadosh b'kedusha shlomim. So when Maser Sheni money is designated for the purpose of shlomim, the sanctity of shlomim takes hold on it, and that's why the hide is lo yotza lechulin. So the Gemara rejects this and says, Ha itmar Allah, Amar Rav, lo kani shlomim. Right, which would support Rabbi Ami, that lo kani shlomim. Umay lo yotza ha'or lechulin. It says in the Mishnah that the or remains kadosh, hachi kamar. Eno b'toras lotzeis ha'or lechulin. It is not consecrated for the sake of shlomim at all, because shlomim sanctity cannot take hold on top of Maser Sheni. So the Gemara is like reinterpreting the Mishnah from one extreme to the other now. We thought it means that lo yotza lechulin, har lechulin means that it has the kedusha of Maser Sheni. And that would teach us that kani, that you are able to clone onto Maser Sheni money, kedusha shlom. But now we're saying just the opposite. Milo yotza or lechulin, eno b'toras lotzeis ha'or lechulin. Doesn't have the sanctity of shlomim. My timer, Amaraba nase kilokeach shor lecharisha. He says the Gemara rejects the previous assumption that if Shlomim's sanctity would take hold, then even the hide would be consecrated. Rather, it adopts the position that if monetary Shlomim's sanctity would take hold, then the hide would be deconsecrated. Because an animal consecrated for the purpose of Shlomim offerings is treated no differently than actual Shlomim. Thus, acquiring Shlomim's sanctity would be a reason for the hide to be deconsecrated. The Mishnah teaches, however, that the hide is not deconsecrated. The reason is that Shlomim's sanctity does not take hold, and consequently there's no basis for the hide to lose the Meiser Sheni status that was previously attached. It is forbidden to spend Meiser Sheni money on an ox for plowing, since the money must be spent on food. If one does spend it for this purpose, the entire value of the ox, including its hide, is reserved for Maser Sheni. The dispensation that excludes hide from acquiring Maser Sheni sanctity applies only in a case where the Maser Sheni money is spent properly. In our case, too, the one who bought a chaya for the sake of Shlomim did not spend the Maser Sheni money properly. For the proper use of Maser Sheni is to buy behemoths for Shlomim and chayos for basar taiva. Since he purchased the chaya for a purpose that it's not fit for, namely for Shlomim, he does not qualify for the dispensation regarding its hide. Itmar. Hamatvis mos Meiser Sheni l'Shlomim, Rabbi Yochanan Makani, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Lo Kani. So this seems to be a repeat of the machlokas here that we had between Rabbi Ami and the Makshan who wanted to reject Rabbi Ami. And Rabbi Eliezer seems to hold like Rabbi Ami, that you cannot be matvis mais shlomim onto Meiser Sheni. So the Gemara says, "I'll leave it to Rabbi Yehudi Amar Meiser Moni Mamon Hedjodu Kuliyamalo Pliyivekani." Even Rabbi Eliezer would have to agree that according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that Meiser Sheni is Mamon Hedjod, right? Because the Torah allows you to take Meiser Sheni and spend it in Yerushalayim for food. So therefore, basically, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if I understand correctly, Meiser Sheni money is considered mamon. Now you want to be matfis kedusha shlomim onto mamon, that you can do. Ki pligia leave the Rabbi Meir diam Meiser mamon gavahu. That it means that kedushas Meiser Sheni is such that it's not his personal property. He cannot be mekadosh an isha with it. Is man diam lo kani ki Rabbi Meir. If you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, like Rabbi Eliezer, that you cannot be matvis kedusha shlomim onto Meiser Sheni, that's straightforward Rabbi Meir. In other words, you can't be matvis kedusha shlom onto kedushas Meiser Sheni. Uman diyomer koni, but about Rabbi Yochanan, how does he square with Rabbi Meir who holds mamon gavoahu? Is kevon de maser korev shlomim? Right, well, if you use the money of Maser Sheni properly, you buy a carbon shlomim. Is ki mitvas leinami tofis. Now the Torah allows you to clone on top of Maser Sheni kedusha shlomim, because that's the whole purpose that the Torah wants you to use the domim of Maser Sheni for shlomim. Since it is recommended to invest Maseches money into shlamim, one can not only buy the shlamim, but he can also clone the kedusha shlamim onto the damim themselves. Rabbi Lazar concurs with the opinion of Ami that we said on our own. So we learn that Rav Ami stated his ruling only according to Rabbi Meir. Okay, fine. Meisvei, the Gemara now is going to raise a question against Rabbi Lazar. The Brisa says, "Hamatfis mos ma'aser sheni l'shlamim." Right, he tries to convert the kedushas ma'aser sheni to kedushas shlamim. Kshu podon mosif aleim shnei chumshin. Normally, when you pod the ma'aser sheni, you add one chumash, but in this case, you're going to have to add two chumshin if you do a pigeon. Why? Echad lekodesh, v'echad lemaser. So the echad lemaser we understand because whenever you pod the maser, you have to add 1/5, 20% of chumash. But now it has kedusha shlomim, which is against Rebbe Loza, because Rebbe Loza says you cannot add kedusha shlom to kedushas maser sheni. And yet the Brisa says that you have to add another chomesh because you upode shlamim. So you see that the kedusha shlamim is chal. And the Gemara answers, "Mi savris divrei hakol, he hamani Rabbi Yehuda he." This Brisa reflects the shita Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Elazar was going according to Rabbi Meir, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, Maser Sheni is mamon hedjot, and since it's masish is hedjot, therefore even Rabbi Lazar would agree, as we said before, that he can be matfis kedusha shlamim. Kani. Okay, let's see what we can accomplish here in the Mishnah. Minayin li omer harelai toda shelo yavi ela minachulin. Right, in the Mishnah, we learned, right, the Friedrich Mishnah, that if you declare, I take upon myself to bring a carbon toda, then you cannot buy the carbon toda with mos ma'aser sheni. Talmud Lomer, how do we derive this? V'zavachta pesach Hashem elokecha tzon ubakar. Right, in the parsha of Maser Sheni, in Parshas Re'eh, what does it say? V'zavachta pesach Hashem elokecha tzon ubakar. What does that mean, tzon ubakar? Follow pesach einu ba ela min hakvasim min ha'izin. Right, it's a lamb or a goat, not from bakar, not from cows. In Matam Alomer Tzonu Bakar. So how could the Torah say that you bring the carbon pesach from Tzonu Bakar? Lahakish kol haba min hatzonu min habakar lepesach. So the Torah means to create a hekesh between anything that's brought from Tzonu Bakar and the carbon pesach. What do we derive from this hekesh? Ma pesach davar shechova v'ein ba ela min hachulin. Right, if you're bringing a carbon pesach from kvasim or izim, it's got to be minachulin. Af kol davar shebechova ein ba el minachulin. So we're going to derive Toda from the paradigm of Pesach, and it's Eino Ba El Menachulin. And what gives us the right to expand that? Because in the parish of Pesach, which we know is Eino Ba Menachulin, the Torah adds Tzonu Bakar to expand it beyond the confines of Pesach and to include any carbon chova. Now, how do we know that Pesach is only Ba Menachulin? That's going to be the sugya in the Gemara. Lefichach, says the Mishnah. Homer Harei Alai Toda, or Harei Alai Shlomim, Holu Bon Chova, since you're obligated now through the neder that you took, is Lo Yaviu Ela Menachulin. He cannot use most Meiser Sheni, they have Kedushas Meiser Sheni, to fulfill his neder of Shlomim or Toda. Unesachim b'chol makom lo yaviu el menachul. So the nesachim that have to accompany a carbon ola or a carbon Shlomim have to come from chulin and not from most ma'aser sheni. Now, in the case of Toda and Shlomim, since Toda is also a carbon Shlomim to some extent, therefore he has to bring the Sachim to accompany the carbon. And just like we said that the carbon itself cannot come, whether it's Shlomim or Toda, from Mos Ma'aser Sheni, so to the Nesachim that accompany the carbon have to come from Chulin, they cannot come from Mos Ma'aser Sheni. So Ma'aser Sheni monies have to be spent on foods that are eaten. Now, we said in the previous Mishnah that if he takes Mos Ma'aser Sheni and he buys an animal, he could use that animal for shlom. Or if he buys wheat in Yerushalayim, he could use that wheat for lachmei toda. And the reason for that is because although you can only use Mos Ma'aser Sheni for something that you can eat, but since shlomim are eaten by the bailim and lachmei toda likewise are eaten by the bailim, therefore you can use that money for an animal for shlomim and wheat for lachmei toda. But in the case of nesachim, on the other hand, where the nesachim are completely poured on the mizbeach, then you can't purchase with Ma'aser Sheni monies yayin l'nesachim because there's no element of eating, right? Yeah, Ma'aser Sheni money has to be designated for something that you can eat. The Gemara immediately asks, "Who Pesach gufe minolon?" Right? How do we know that Pesach itself has to come from Chulin and cannot come from Ma'aser Sheni? To Sanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Nemar Pesach b'Mitzrayim, v'Nemar Pesach l'Doros. Ma Pesach ha'Omer Mitzrayim lo ba el min Chulin. Right? That's because they didn't have Ma'aser Sheni. Ma'aser Sheni would only apply to crops that grew in Eretz Yisrael, but not in Egypt. Is af Pesach ha'Omer l'Doros lo ba el min Chulin. We have a principle that you cannot derive situations where it's possible from situations which are not possible. So there, in the Mitzrayim situation, it was impossible to have Ma'aser Sheni because Ma'aser Sheni has to come from the crops of Eretz Yisrael. So how can you derive, for all posterity, the halacha of Korban Pesach from the case of Pesach HaOmer b'Mitzrayim, Amalei, Rabbi Lezer responds, Afal pishi efsha raya gedola even ilmad mimenu. You're right. I cannot prove it, but on the other hand, I can prove it. Meaning, we could derive halachas from it. And since the first Pesach took place in Mitzrayim, it becomes a model for all future Pesachim, and therefore we derive the halacha that it has to come in Achul and it cannot come from Ma'aser Sheni. Chazer Rabbi Akiva v'danu din acher. Now he has a different rejection of Rabbi Eliezer. Ma Pesach Mitzrayim shekain ein ta'un matan domim ve'emurim l'gabi mizbeach. Pesach Mitzrayim has its own laws, and it's not governed by the normal laws of Korban Pesach. For example, a Korban Pesach requires matan domim, which means you take the dam of the Korban Pesach and you apply it to the Mizbeach. That doesn't apply to Pesach L'Doros. Right? They didn't have a Mizbeach in Mitzrayim. In fact, on the contrary, what did they do with the dam of the Korban Pesach? They put it on the mashkof, etc. So it's interesting. So the dam of Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim was used for the mashkof, and the rest of the korban, which would normally parts that would be a murim on the mizbeach, that which would eaten, but that which was a murim, that was eaten. So Pesach of Mitzrayim is a whole different kind of korban. It's not like shlamim. So to derive the conclusion from Pesach Mitzrayim that you can't take Manos Ma'aser Sheni for a korban Pesach with Doros, that's not a fair conclusion. And here we turn to Daf Pei Beis Amid Beis. Tomer Pesach Doros sheton matan domim ve'murim l'gabi mizbeach. Omalo, so Rabbi Eliezer responds, Harehu Omer ve'avadeto es ha'avoda azos b'chodesh hazeh. So what does Rabbi Eliezer see in this pasuk? Is referring to Pesach, and it teaches us that the avoda of preparing the Pesach has to start on the 14th of Nisan. You call avoda shel chodesh hazeh kozeh. Okay, let's see what if we can figure out what that means. Shayu kol avodos shel hachodesh hazeh kozeh. So the pasuk says, "V'avadetes avoda azos b'chodesh hazeh," teaching us that all the avodos of this chodesh should be like the Pesach Mitzrayim, so that even though Pesach Mitzrayim is a different kind of korban Pesach with its own dinim, but the Torah goes out of its way to tell you that for all doros, and that's called hachodesh hazeh, avodah shel chodesh hazeh kozeh, for all doros, the Pesach ledoros has to be brought in the same way that the Pesach of Mitzrayim was brought, namely from Chulin and not from Ma'aser Sheni. Rabbi Akiva, if you're going to agree that you cannot derive conclusions from a situation where it's impossible to a situation where it's possible, so it's impossible in Mitzrayim to have Ma'aser Sheni, is Leiku b'milsei, then I don't need your drasha here from Avadat Azosa. Why don't I need it? His second argument, Rabbi Eliezer's second argument based on this pasuk, seems to concede that we can theoretically derive the law for a possible situation from that which we find in an impossible situation. If he actually holds that we cannot derive in this manner, it's irrelevant whether the subjects are analogous or not. What does that mean? What's it called? Just one more time, and then I'll let you go. I'm sorry. Rabbi Akiva, Isover lo, Tien donen efshar mishi efshar. Leku b'milsa. What does that mean, leku b'milsa? So again, Rabbi Akiva had two arguments, right? What was his first argument against Rabbi Eliezer? V'chidonim efshar mishi efshar? Question. Now, Rabbi Akiva comes up with a second argument that Pesach Mitzrayim has different laws, and it cannot be compared to Pesach Ludoros. So the Gemara says the following: since Rabbi Akiva in his first argument says Ein Donim Efshar Misha Efshar, why does he need a second argument? Namely, that Pesach Mitzrayim is so unique and so different. And if he holds that Donin Efshar Misha Efshar, and that's why he needed a second argument. Right, because of the fact that Pesach Mitzrayim doesn't have a Matan Domim or a Mur Malgabi Mizbeach, is in Pesach Midbar Yochia. Why? Because he's now holding that Donim, right? Hadarbe. So what does Hadarbe mean? Hadarbe means Donim Efshar Misha Efshar. So if Donim Efshar Misha Efshar, then we have a proof from Pesach Mitzrayim, because there was no Ma'aser Sheni in Pesach Mitzrayim. So Gemara answers, L'dvar of Rabbi Eliezer Ka'omar, Lidi Di'ein Donim Efshar Mishi Efshar, my first argument is sufficient. But Lidi Doch, according to you, and you maintain, Rabbi Eliezer, that Donim Efshar Mishi Efshar, and therefore, since in Pesach Mitzrayim they didn't have what? They didn't have Ma'aser Sheni, therefore I could derive that for the Doros, he cannot bring a Pesach from Ma'aser Sheni. Is therefore ma le Pesach Mitzrayim shekain ein tonim matan domim ve'mur l'gavim mizbeach tomer Pesach Adoros sheton matan domim ve'mur l'gavim mizbeach. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva argues that according to you, Rabbi Eliezer, even if you hold done in efshar mishi efshar, but nevertheless, how can you derive Pesach Lidoros from Pesach Mitzrayim? You see that they're not comparable, they're not analogous, because Pesach Mitzrayim does not require Matan Domim or Haktorah Seimurim Al Gabi Mizbeach. Amalei Rabbi Eliezer v'Avadato. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer has to invoke a drasha from a pasuk in order to prove that Pesach Lidoros is derived from Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Lemidbar. Rabbi Eliezer Lemalei Pesach Midbar Yochiach. In other words, why does Rabbi Eliezer need to quote a pasuk if he holds that what? that donim efshar mishe'i efshar lidvar Rabbi Akiva kamal lidi di donim efshar mishe'i. I don't need a pasuk. Ah, umishum hai pircha Pesach midbar yochiach. Ah, because I made a mistake here. Pesach midbar means after they left Mitzrayim and for 40 years they were in the midbar, they didn't have Maser Sheni, but the dam of the Korban Pesach, right? No, right? They had a Mishkan and a Mizbeach, so they would definitely do a Matan Domim and Haktor Simurim on the Mizbeach in the midbar. And that was brought only from what? From Chulin. So therefore, your pircha would not be a pircha. And if I hold done in Efsha Mishi Efsha, your pircha is slugged up by the fact that Pesach Midbar had matan domim, even though there was no what? There was no Ma'aser Sheni. Is lidach the Amrit the Ein Donim Efsha Mishi Efsha. But according to you, that we cannot derive Efsha Mishi Efsha, and therefore whether it's Pesach Mitzrayim or Pesach Midbar, in all cases, the absence of Ma'aser Sheni was simply because they didn't have crops from Eretz Yisrael, and that's lo efshar. So therefore, I have to induce and invoke a pasuk of Yavadet. Okay, that's where we'll have to stop now.